The telegram felt like a betrayal in Arthur Bishop's hand, the paper softened by sweat. It read simply, "Worker arrives Tuesday stage. Strong. Good with figures." Payment on arrival. He'd sent the wire to a Sacramento agent 3 weeks ago, sinking his last $20 into the hope it would deliver a solution. His cattle ranch, clinging to the dry hills of the Nevada Territory, was bleeding money, and the ledgers he kept were a mess of numbers that swam before his eyes. He needed a hand, someone young and sharp who could make sense of the columns and wasn't afraid of the hard work that followed. He'd pictured a wiry young man, maybe fresh from the east, eager to prove himself. But when the stagecoach wheezed to a halt in a cloud of alkali dust, the person who stepped out was not a wiry young man. She was a woman, Chinese, and younger than he'd expected, maybe 23 at most. She moved with a deliberate grace that seemed out of place in the grimy, sun-baked street of dusty Harmony Creek. She wore a high-collared silk dress the color of a dawn cloud, a pale pink that should have been instantly soiled by the grit in the air but somehow wasn't. Her black hair was coiled in a precise knot, and she held a single, sturdy-looking cloth traveling bag. She scanned the small crowd of dusty miners and merchants, her gaze finally landing on Arthur. He was easy to spot, being the only man standing there staring as if he'd seen a ghost. She walked directly toward him, her steps measured and confident. She stopped a few feet away and gave a small, formal bow of her head. "You are Mr. Bishop?" she asked. Her voice was clear, the English precise, with only a slight, melodic accent. Arthur just nodded, his throat suddenly tight. He held up the telegram. "I was expecting a worker." "I am the worker," she said, her expression unreadable. She held out a hand, not for shaking, but to present her own copy of the wire. "My name is Lin Mai. The agent assured me you required assistance with accounting and general duties." Arthur looked from her face to the telegram, then back again. The agent hadn't lied. The wire didn't specify a man. But the idea was so preposterous he felt a hot flush of anger and embarrassment creep up his neck. A woman like this, in a dress like that, wouldn't last a day on his ranch. The work would break her, or the loneliness would. "There's been a mistake," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "This is cattle country. It's no place for you." "The agent took my money for the passage," Lin Mai stated calmly, as if discussing the weather. "The agreement was for 3 months' work, room, and board, plus wages. You may send me back, but you will have to pay for the return ticket." "I do not have the funds." He was trapped. He'd spent his last cash on her arrival, and the thought of spending more to send her away was galling. The stage wasn't due back for another week. He looked around. The town's few residents were watching, their curiosity poorly veiled. He saw Franklin Vance, the man who bought most of his cattle, standing outside the saloon, a smug look on his face. Vance enjoyed seeing other men stumble. "Fine," Arthur bit out, the word tasting like rust. "Get your things." He turned without another word and strode toward his buckboard wagon, leaving her to follow. He could feel her presence behind him, a quiet, unhurried shadow. He threw her bag in the back and climbed onto the driver's seat, not offering a hand. She managed on her own, settling onto the hard wooden bench beside him, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. The ride back to the ranch was a long, silent battle. The summer sun beat down, turning the air into a shimmering haze. The wheels of the buckboard churned up a constant plume of fine, pale dust that coated everything. Arthur kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, his jaw set. He was furious with the agent, with his own bad luck, and, unfairly, with the woman beside him. He could feel her stillness, a stark contrast to his own churning frustration. She didn't complain about the heat or the dust. She simply sat there, observing the vast, empty landscape of sagebrush and rock as it rolled by. Hours passed. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple. The heat finally began to break, but the day's exhaustion settled deep into Arthur's bones. He'd been up since before dawn, fixing a fence line, and the tension of the day had worn him down completely. He imagined it must be the same for her, after a long journey on a cramped stagecoach. He risked a sideways glance. Her eyes were closed. Her posture, once so perfectly straight, had softened. As he watched, her head began to nod forward, catching herself once, then twice. The buckboard hit a rut, jostling them both. The small motion was enough. Her head tilted to the side, and with a quiet, almost imperceptible sigh, she leaned against his shoulder and fell into a deep sleep. His entire body went rigid. Her head was a light, warm weight against his arm. He could feel the soft fabric of her dress and the faint, clean scent of soap and something else, something like faint tea. His first instinct was to shrug her off, to wake her and restore the cold distance between them. But he didn't. He sat there, stiff as a fence post, his hand gripping the reins so tightly his knuckles were white. The anger he'd been nursing all afternoon began to seep away, replaced by something unfamiliar. He looked down at her sleeping face. The unreadable mask of composure was gone. In sleep, she looked younger, more vulnerable. A strand of black hair had come loose and lay across her cheek. Without thinking, he had the absurd impulse to reach over and tuck it back into place. He caught himself, his hand clenching again on the reins. For the rest of the ride, he drove with exaggerated care, avoiding ruts and rocks, trying not to disturb her. The silence of the wagon was different now. It was no longer a hostile space between two strangers. It was a shared quiet, a fragile truce under the enormous, star-dusted sky. He felt a strange protectiveness, an emotion so foreign and unwelcome it made his chest ache. This woman was a problem, a complication he couldn't afford. But as she slept beside him, her head resting on his shoulder, Arthur Bishop felt the first crack appear in the lonely fortress he had built around himself. He did not yet know that the numbers in his ledger were not the only thing she was here to fix. The ranch house was little more than a sturdy clapboard box against the immense landscape. Arthur gave Linmai the small spare room, which was clean but bare, containing only a narrow cot and a crate for a table. He expected complaints, or at least a look of dismay. Instead, she simply thanked him and closed the door. He spent the evening staring into his cold hearth, the feeling of her head on his shoulder a phantom warmth that refused to fade. The next morning, she emerged from her room dressed not in silk, but in a simple, dark tunic and trousers of a practical cut he'd never seen before. Her hair was braided neatly down her back. She met him in the main room where he'd been wrestling with the ledger. "I will start with the books," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. He shoved the heavy volume across the rough-hewn table. "Knock yourself out." He was still gruff, but the sharp edge of his anger had dulled. He watched her for a moment. Her fingers, long and slender, traced the columns of his messy handwriting. She pulled a small, wooden device with beads on wires from her bag, an abacus, and her fingers began to fly across it, a soft, rhythmic clicking filling the quiet room. He left her to it and went outside, feeling strangely obsolete in his own home. For 3 days, they barely spoke. He worked the ranch, mending fences, tending to the small herd, and she worked at the table, her focus absolute. The quiet clicking of the abacus became a new sound in the house, as constant as the wind. On the 4th day, she looked up when he came in for his midday meal. "There is a problem, Mr. Bishop," she said. Her face was serious. "The numbers for your cattle sales do not add up. According to your own notes on herd counts, and the prices Mr. Vance has paid you over the last year, you should have at least $600 more in profit." Arthur stopped, a piece of jerky halfway to his mouth. "What are you talking about?" "Vance weighs them and pays me the going rate." "He pays you a rate," she corrected gently. "But it is not the rate the territorial papers report from the railhead. It is consistently lower. And I suspect his weights are inaccurate. He is stealing from you, a little at a time, with every sale." The accusation hung in the air. Arthur had long harbored a sliver of suspicion about Franklin Vance, a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes. But he dismissed it as the sour envy of a failing rancher. To hear it laid out so plainly, by this quiet woman with her clicking beads and sharp eyes, gave the suspicion a terrifying weight. It meant he wasn't just unlucky, he was a fool. "I need to see his books," Arthur said, his voice low. He will not show you, Linmai replied. But you can challenge him. The next time you sell, demand to see the scales balanced with a certified weight first. Demand the territorial rate. Do it publicly. Her logic was a cold, hard line in the sand. A public confrontation with Franklin Vance was tantamount to declaring war. Vance wasn't just a cattle buyer, he owned the freight company, held the mortgage on the general store, and had the town sheriff in his pocket. To challenge him was to challenge the entire town of Harmony Creek. But the alternative was to slowly bleed out, to lose the ranch his father had built. He looked at Linmai. She wasn't afraid. Her gaze was steady, waiting for his decision. For the first time, he saw her not as a delicate woman from the city, but as an ally. The following week, Arthur drove his cattle to town. Linmai sat beside him on the buckboard, the ledger resting in her lap. When they arrived at Vance's stockyard, Arthur did exactly as she'd suggested. Franklin, Arthur said, his voice loud enough for the half-dozen other ranchers and hands to hear. Before we weigh my steers, I want to see you balance those scales with the 50-pound certified weight from the assayer's office. Vance, who had been all smiles, let his expression harden. Now, Arthur, you know my scales are true. We've been doing business for years. Just the same, Arthur insisted. I'd like to see it. And I'd like to discuss the rate. The Telegraph from Carson City says prime beef is fetching 4 cents a pound at the railhead. You've been paying me 2.5. A tense silence fell over the stockyard. Everyone stopped what they were doing to watch. Vance's eyes flickered to Linmai, sitting silently on the wagon, and a look of contemptuous understanding dawned on his face. I see, he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. You've been listening to bad advice, Arthur. Getting your figures from an outside source, he let the words hang in the air, thick with prejudice. My price accounts for the freight, the risk. It's the price everyone here gets. It's a fair price for this territory. He turned to the other ranchers. Isn't that right, boys? There were murmurs of agreement. These men also sold to Vance. They were either too scared or too beaten down to question him. They looked at Arthur with a mixture of pity and resentment for rocking the boat. They looked at Linmai with open suspicion. The confrontation had failed. Vance had expertly turned the crowd, using their distrust of an outsider to isolate Arthur completely. Defeated, Arthur had no choice but to sell at Vance's price. The ride back to the ranch was even more silent than the first one. The weight of public humiliation pressed down on him. He had not only failed to expose Vance, he had made himself and Linmai pariahs. As they unhitched the team in the fading light, Vance's foreman, a big man with a cruel mouth, rode into their yard. He didn't dismount. He spat a stream of tobacco juice near Arthur's boots. Mr. Vance wanted me to deliver a message, he said, his eyes lingering on Linmai with a sneer. He appreciates your business. But he doesn't appreciate folks who bring trouble. He suggests you be real careful with your assets. A fire can start easy in a dry summer. Cattle can get spooked. The foreman wheeled his horse around and galloped away, leaving the threat hanging in the dusty air. The fight was no longer about money. It was about survival. That night, the small ranch house felt like a besieged fort. Arthur paced the floor, the foreman's words echoing in his mind. He was outmaneuvered, outnumbered, and now, openly threatened. He had dragged Linmai into this, a woman he was responsible for, and put her in danger. The guilt was a physical weight. He stopped his pacing and looked at her. She was sitting at the table, calmly cleaning a lantern chimney, her movements precise and steady. She seemed to be the only calm thing in his chaotic world. You should leave, he said, the words costing him more than he expected. I can find the money to send you back to Sacramento. This isn't your fight. Linmai finished her task and looked up at him, her dark eyes searching his face. Why did you never question Mr. Vance before, even when you suspected him? The question caught him off guard. He's a powerful man. I'm just one man. I didn't have any proof. You have it now, she said quietly. And you are not just one man. He let out a harsh, bitter laugh. What are we? A broke rancher and a woman he can't protect. Vance will ruin me. He'll drive us out. He will if we let him, she said. Tell me, Mr. Bishop, why do you stay here? This land is hard. The town is against you. What are you fighting for? He sank into a chair opposite her, the fight draining out of him. My father built this place. He put his whole life into this land. He died thinking it would be something. I feel like I'm failing him every single day. It was an admission he'd never spoken aloud to anyone. A long silence settled between them. Then, Lin Mai spoke, her voice soft but firm. My father was a merchant in Sacramento. He was a good man, an honest man. He built a successful business supplying the railroad crews. He trusted the men he dealt with. One of them was a man much like your Mr. Vance. He used contracts with confusing English words to cheat my father. He took the business, the building, everything. My father, he lost his spirit. He died a year later. She reached into her traveling bag and pulled out the abacus and a small, leather-bound book. She laid them on the table. It was a ledger, just like his, but filled with neat columns of Chinese characters. My father taught me numbers, she said, her hand resting on the worn cover. After he died, I taught myself English law. I read every contract I could find. I learned how men like Vance use paper and fear to become powerful. I answered your telegram because it was for work far away from that city, a place where I thought my skills could be used for something good, to build, not just to defend. She looked at him, and for the first time, he saw past her composure to the fierce, wounded heart beneath. So you see, Mr. Bishop, she said, her voice gaining a steely edge, this is very much my fight, too. In that moment, everything shifted. He wasn't looking at a fragile employee, but a warrior armed with knowledge he couldn't comprehend. Her secret history didn't just reframe her, it reframed him. He wasn't a lone man failing his father's legacy. He was a partner to someone who understood his enemy better than he did. A loud noise from outside shattered the quiet. A low, rumbling sound, like distant thunder, that was growing steadily louder. The cattle. Arthur was on his feet in an instant, grabbing his rifle from the wall. He ran to the door and looked out into the moonless night. He could hear the panicked bellows of his herd and see dark shapes moving near the far end of the pasture. Vance's men. They were making good on their threat, starting a stampede. They're running them toward the ravine, he yelled, his mind racing. If the herd went over the edge, he'd be ruined. He expected Lin Mai to stay inside, to hide. But when he turned, she was right behind him, holding the lit lantern high. Her face was pale but determined. How do we stop them? She asked. We have to turn them, he said, his mind working frantically. Get ahead of the lead steer and make them circle back. It was a desperate, foolish plan for one man on foot. But as he started to run, she ran with him, holding the lantern steady, a small, defiant light in the overwhelming darkness. Her presence beside him, her refusal to be afraid, gave him a surge of strength he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't just one man. 6 months later, the first green shoots of spring were pushing through the hard-packed earth of the yard. The winter had been harsh, but the ranch had survived. More than survived, it had changed. That night, Arthur and Lin Mai had managed the impossible. Using the lantern and shouting until their throats were raw, they'd turned the herd just before the ravine, saving the majority of the cattle. It was a small victory, but it was everything. It proved they could stand together against the darkness. After that, they stopped fighting Vance's game and started playing their own. Lin Mai, with her knowledge of contracts and freight law, discovered that the new railroad spur, 200 miles north, had established its own stockyards. They were desperate for beef and paying premium prices. The contracts were ironclad and backed by the railroad company itself. Arthur, for his part, used his reputation, tarnished as it was in Harmony Creek, with the smaller ranchers in the outlying valleys. He showed them Lin Mai's figures, the proof of Vance's years of quiet theft. He spoke of the railroad, of a way to break free. It was a huge risk, a long cattle drive through difficult country, but 3 other ranchers, men as desperate as he was, agreed to join him. They pooled their herds, creating a force large enough to make the journey worthwhile. The drive was grueling, but they succeeded. They sold their cattle for nearly double what Vance had ever paid them, the payment coming in solid gold coin and bank drafts from a legitimate railroad bank. Arthur stood on his porch, looking out at a pasture that was now properly fenced, with a new, sturdy-looking barn standing proud against the skyline. He held a cup of coffee, the morning air crisp and clean. The ledger on the table inside was no longer a source of dread. It was a testament, its columns filled with Lin Mai's elegant script, the final page showing a healthy profit. Lin Mai came to stand beside him. She no longer wore the city dresses or even the dark, practical tunic she'd arrived in. She wore a durable denim work skirt and a simple cotton shirt, clothes of the frontier. But she wore them with the same innate grace she'd had that first day. The hard months had not broken her, they had revealed her strength. "The new bull is settling in well with the heifers," Arthur said, breaking the comfortable silence. "He should," she replied, a small smile touching her lips. "He cost enough." He smiled back, a real smile that felt easy and natural. "A good investment. Like hiring a worker, good with figures." Their eyes met. In her gaze, he saw not just the sharp intelligence he'd come to rely on, but a deep, quiet warmth that had thawed the frozen ground of his own heart. He was no longer just a man trying to honor his father's memory. He was a man building a future he could not imagine without her. The town of Harmony Creek still kept its distance, but it no longer mattered. Franklin Vance's power had been broken. When the other ranchers saw the success of the cattle drive, his hold on the territory crumbled. He was just a bitter man in a shrinking pond. Arthur looked out at the land, his land, saved not by his own strength, but by the quiet courage of the woman beside him. He had sent a telegram asking for help with his books, a simple request for a simple problem. What he had received was something else entirely. He had received a partner. "The books are balanced, Arthur," she said softly. He nodded, looking from the greening hills back to her face. "Yes," he said. "They are. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.